Okay. So, right here. I almost forgot them, and then Jonathan reminded me that it's in there. Thank you. Okay, so we'll share the screen. We'll jump right in, chapter 14, and we have a description of a battle. There's 4 kings and there's 5 kings, and there's this big battle taking place. Here we go. Now it came to pass. I'm reading the translation on the screen. It may be a little different than the art scroll. Now it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, the king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedar Laomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, the king of Goyim. So these are the 4 kings. That they waged war with Bera, the king of Sodom, Birsha, the king of Gomorrah, Shinav, the king of Admah, Shemever, the king of Tsevoim, and the king of Bela, which is Tzoar. So we have 4 kings against 5 kings. So we know the people engaged in the battle. Where did they meet? All these joined in the valley of Sidim, which is the Dead Sea. So obviously the battle takes place very close to Sodom. What was the purpose of the battle? There's got to be a reason to go to war. You can't just go to war. You got to go to the Congress and you have to declare war and figure out why we went to war. So here's the problem. It's always about taxes. Here it goes, 14, verse 4. For 12 years they served Kedar Laomer, and for 13 years they rebelled, right? So these 5 kings living in the valley of Sodom are paying taxes. They're serving, which means paying taxes to Kedar Laomer. And then 13, they had enough. Now it says 13 years they rebel. Most people believe it means 13 years. Some people think it means the 13th year. But let's assume 13 years is the rebellion. It takes 13 years to get to go to war, as you'll see that there's a whole coalition here. These 4 kings don't necessarily live very in close proximity. So it took time to build a coalition against the 5 kings. And so 12 years they served, either the 13th year or for 13 years they rebelled, and then you get to the 14th year. What happens in the 14th year? Verse 5, and in the 14th year, Kedar Laomer came, and the kings who were with him, and they smote the Rephaim and Ashtarot Karnaim, and the Zuzim and Ham, and the Amim and Shaveh Kiryatayim, and the Horites in their mountain Seir, until the plain of Haran, which is alongside the desert. So maybe later we'll put up a map and we'll show exactly where these nations are. But they're coming and they're basically hitting everybody. They're attacking everybody and conquering every nation in their way, these 4 kings. And they returned and came to Ein Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and they smote the entire field of Amalekites and also the Amorites who dwelt in Chatzitzon Tamar. By the way, they're coming to fight the 5 kings. We read just now how many verses? Verse 5, 6, 7 is battles against other nations and other kings on the way. They didn't even get to Sodom yet. In verse 8, we're going to think about the confrontation with Sodom. And verse 8 and 9 repeats. So you have repeats the people who are battling now. Finally, when we get to the point that's relevant to us, which is the battle of Sodom. So you have verse 8, and the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah and the king of Admah and the king of Tsevoim and the king of Bela, which is in Zoar, came forth, and they engaged them in battle in the valley of Sidim. Verse 8, we know this already. In any case, in verse 9, in case you forgot, we're going to reiterate their names. With Kedar Laomer, the king of Elam, Tidal, the king of Goyim, Amraphel, the king of Shinar, and the Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against the 5. You see, everything is being repeated here so many times. In any case, let's see what happens in the battle. Verse 10, now the valley of Sidim was composed of many clay pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and they fell there, and the survivors fled to the mountain. Notice there's no battle. There's just fleeing, right? The 4 kings of armies come. It doesn't say there's a battle. It just says they meet, and all of a sudden the kings of Sodom are fleeing, and either people fell into those clay fields, which then and now, that area is a place where people mine various forms of earth, clay, or other things, asphalt, different things are mined there. Even until today, you can go and see it. In any case, so some of them fell in, some of them run to the mountains. And they, meaning the 4 kings, verse 11, took the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food, and they departed. And they took Lot and his possessions, the son of Abraham's brother, and they departed. And he was living in Sodom. Who was living in Sodom? Avram's nephew, as we read last week. So this is the story. This is the battle. Now we start talking about how it relates to our story, to Abraham. So now Avram gets the news. Because remember, Avram told his nephew, we should part. If you go right, I go left. You go left, I go right. And the commentaries explain what it means is I'm not sending you off and cutting ties with you. But if you ever get into trouble, I'm not too far. You're right and left, which relate to each other. If you ever get into trouble, I'm going to come and save you. And that's exactly what Abraham does at this point. He hears about this, verse 13. So 13 gets the news. And go ahead.
So is this before the destruction of Sodom?
Yes, destruction of Sodom was confusing because we read the destruction of Sodom yesterday, but that was Vayera. That's the second portion of Abraham.
Right, okay.
This is Lech Lecha. This is the portion. This is the first time.
We're in Lech Lecha.
We're in Lech Lecha. So what do we know about Sodom so far? We know nothing. We know so far last week, in other words, in chapter 13, we read that Abraham and Lot part. Lot chooses the place that's the most beautiful in Israel. In other words, Kagan Hashem, like the Garden of God, like the land of Egypt. So it's like, what's the Garden of God? People think it's like Garden of Eden. What's the Garden of God? Anyone know what the Garden of God is? But Garden of God means it's the most like Eden. It's peaceful, it's tranquil, it's beautiful, it's watered, it's wonderful. It's like Egypt, which means the plain, which means the area where the Nile is, which is very fertile, and that's the equivalent of Egypt in Israel. Abraham is on the mountains, and Abraham is told. So that's all we know so far. And then there's this battle where all of Sodom is taken captive, and Lot is taken captive. So Abraham says, I have to come and help my brother, but first he has to hear about it. So there's a fugitive. So the fugitive came. Fugitive, we assume, from the battle. There's a medrash that says it's Og who was saved from the flood, but that's the medrash. Rashi quotes it. But right now he's the fugitive from the battle. That's the pshat. That's the simple meaning. So he comes and he tells Abraham the Hebrew. This is important. The only time in the Torah where Abraham is called Avram HaIvri, Abraham the Hebrew. Okay, so these are hints. These are hints of what's really happening here. What do I need to know all this information? So I'm just laying down the hints, and later we come again, and we put all the pieces of the puzzle together. But it's interesting to note the only time in the Torah that Abraham is called the Hebrew. The next time they're called Hebrews is in Egypt.
Right. So Isaac and Jacob never called Hebrew.
Not explicitly in the Torah. We know they were Hebrews because their descendants are Hebrews when they end up in Egypt. So when in the book of Exodus they're called Hebrews, even if I'm not mistaken, when they go to Egypt, when the sons of Jacob go to Egypt, the Torah does refer to them as Hebrews when it says they don't want to eat with Pharaoh because the Hebrews don't eat with the Egyptians. But Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob themselves, sort of giving a title like you have over here, the fugitive came and told Abraham the Hebrew, this is the only time.
Joseph's called the Hebrew in the house of Potiphar.
Joseph himself?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's the descendants of Jacob. Joseph or Joseph's brothers? Joseph? Okay, that could be. When Nar Ivri, of course. Yes, when he's taken, when he's a slave, when he's put in prison, and the minister of Pharaoh comes and tells Pharaoh about Joseph, who is a dream interpreter. He says, there with us was a Hebrew lad. Yes. So again, the descendants of Jacob, the children of Jacob, are called Hebrews. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob themselves are not called Hebrews. Also, in those cases, there are people talking about Joseph or people talking about the Hebrews. Here's the narrator, the Torah itself, the narrator, saying Abraham the Hebrew the only time. Just interesting to point out. Of course, later on, we'll come back around and you'll see that it's significant. In any case, so Abraham hears it. So he comes and tells Abraham the Hebrew. And he was living in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, the brother of Eshcol, and the brother of Aner, who were Abraham's confederates. Hebrew, Baalei Brit Avraham. Baalei Brit, the members of the covenant. They have a covenant with Abraham. Now, they can have a covenant with Abraham that they're going to protect each other. Makes sense if you're living in a tribal region, if you're living in a place with so many kings, as you'll see in a moment, there's so many kings here. So you want to make covenants with other tribes. Some people say it's not just the covenant. It's also, we're talking about covenant in the spiritual sense, right? Abraham has a covenant with God, and these people are the ones who also are in that covenant. In other words, also believe in Avram's belief system, which is also going to be important, as we will see. So that tells us where he is. Abraham hears this. Abraham heard that his kinsman, Achiv, his brother. I don't know what kinsman means, if anybody knows. I guess it's someone related to you. But in Hebrew, your kin, family, relative. Kin.
Next of kin.
Could my second cousin be my kin?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is part of the clan, family.
So in Hebrew, it's Achiv, my brother. To me, it sounds more closer, right? Achiv, his brother. It's his nephew, but he refers to him as his brother. Even though when you go to Israel, everybody's my brother, Achi. You go to Tel Aviv, everyone's like, Achi, my brother. I never met you, I never meet you again, but we're all brothers. That's the way it goes in Hebrew, in Israel. In any case.
Also in the South Bronx.
And in Brooklyn, and in Crown Heights.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I have a question. It's interesting because in the art scroll, the newer one that I got recently, it does not say Abram the Hebrew. It says the Ivri.
Yeah, Ivri is the Hebrew word, which means Ivri is Hebrew for Hebrew. How do I say this? Ivri is Hebrew for Hebrew. In other
So
words,
those are okay.
Hebrew is
That's
the
a second.
translation of Ivri. You're right. So they don't want to get into it because they don't want to translate what it means. They don't want to get into the translation, so they solve it by just using the Hebrew word.
Okay.
Which
Thank
helps
you.
them, which is very helpful for them, but not so helpful for us.
Okay.
The Abraham, the Hebrew, was that considered a negative trait in those days? Is that how it's interpreted?
The short answer is yes. Let's get into Hebrew right now. Forget about negative. Why is he called Abraham the Hebrew? There's two reasons. There could be two reasons. Let's see what Rashi says. What's the meaning of the word Hebrew? Any Rashi here? No Rashi here. Oh no, of course. There is a Rashi. But Rashi doesn't say the more common one. Rashi says the one, okay. Rashi says the one I want him to say, so that's good. Hebrew could either mean that he's a descendant of a gentleman named Aver. If you look at the children of Shem, Shem had a son, if I'm not mistaken. Shem had a son named Aver. And Aver is the root of Ivri, right? If you don't believe me, which you shouldn't, you should look in the portion of Noach after the flood, where it gives us the descendants of Shem.
So if ever is a descendant of Shem, then it's not exclusive to Jews.
It's not exclusive to Jews. It's not exclusive to Abraham, according to that interpretation.
Right.
Again, Rashi doesn't say that interpretation, but I'm just saying. Yeah, you say he's the most prominent of the children of Abraham. Just like Semites, people refer to us as Semites, even though we're not the only ones. It's funny. You say the Arab. Some people could say, there's Arab anti-Semites. Well, it doesn't really work because Semites means the descendants of Shem, right? So now it became that the word Semites is primarily used to describe the Jews. So a similar thing could happen in those days, where even though Aver has many children, Abraham is known as the descendant of Aver. But you'll see there's another reason which Rashi says, which is probably the reason why we refer to him as Aver. In any case, if you want to look at Aver, you look at Genesis chapter 10, verse 21. I'll read it to you. You don't have to look. In the Art Scroll, it's page 47, verse 21. And to Shem, also to him were born. He was the ancestor of all those who lived on the... they keep jumping around. Okay, this is not bad, actually. He was the ancestor of all those who lived on the other side. This is going to be important. In any case, the brother of Japheth, the elder, the sons of Shem. I'm going to skip 22 with a bunch of names. Verse 24, Arpachshad begot Shelach, and Shelach begot Aver. And to Aver were born two sons. The name of the first was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and the name of his brother was Yaktan. So in other words, you have one of the descendants of Shem is Aver. His name is Aver. So Avram is Aver, he's a Hebrew. But what the Art Scroll just did is in verse 21, they say, and to Shem, also to him were born, he was the ancestor of all those who lived on the other side. In Hebrew, you know what it says in Hebrew? Avi kol b'nei Aver. He's the father of all the children of Aver. Aver can mean two things. Aver can be a name of an individual person, or Aver literally means the other side. And other side of the river. So what's happening here, what Rashi says in our parsha, in Exodus chapter 14, Rashi says that in 13, and the fugitive came and told Abraham the Hebrew, what is Ivri? Hebrew means he's from the other side of the river. So in other words, Abraham is in Israel, but where is he from? He's from Haran or Kasdim. So he's from the other side of the Prat, the other side of the Euphrates River. So when he comes in, everyone knows this guy's the outsider. Now, does Dr. Ken wanted to know, was it a negative? I don't know that it's a negative, but in that region, if you say the outsider, the other is the other, what are you going to do? So you may like him, you may not like him. That's secondary. The point is, he's not from us. He's on the other side. And that is what Rashi says is the meaning of Hebrew. So they come to Abraham, and the fugitive comes to Abraham, the Hebrew, and he says, he gives him the news. So we'll get to the deeper meaning of that in a moment, but that's just enough to get by the question of Dr. Ken, and now we could continue so that we can go back. In any case, so what does Abraham hear? Abraham hears verse 14, and Abraham heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, and he arrived and he armed his trained men, those born in his house, 318, and he pursued them until Dan. It comes all the way to Dan. This is it's all over Israel, but I'll show you the map in a moment. But what's happening is the four kings are coming from the northeast, and they come and they go all the way down from the north to the south on the other side of the Jordan into current day Jordan, and they fight all the kingdoms that we're going to hear about in the book of Deuteronomy. When the Jewish people are coming up from Egypt, they travel through those same kingdoms. So there's certain parallels. We'll get to that in a minute. But in any case, these kings go and they battle. They go down and destroy from north to the south. And when they come to the south, in the south is they have the battle with Sodom, and then they start going home. Abraham now goes and attacks them and chases them when they're going back north. And where does he catch them? Dan. Where is Dan? Way up in the Golan Heights.
That Dan, not the Tel Aviv one.
There's two Dans, but we're talking about the other Dan. Correct. One of the roots. There's one of the rivers the sources that feed the Jordan River is the Dan, right?
I've been to that.
You've been there. I've been there. I've been inside there too. So
I don't understand, Rabbi. There's 318 people. Who are these people?
they're the people that are on Abraham's house. In other words, Abraham is not just a house means they're under his influence. Remember, Abraham, when he came to Israel also, he came with all the souls he made in Haran. In other words, Abraham is not a person sitting alone. He's a person who's preaching. And if he's preaching, he needs a following. So Abraham has a following. First of all, we know he's making covenants with other people. Eshkol, Aner, and Mamre, they're going to appear later as well. So he's interacting with the region, but he also has people that he influences.
So these 318 are all warriors?
Is Abraham a warrior?
Yes,
I mean,
in a way.
But now you find out he is.
Right.
You didn't know that until now. Apparently, when necessary, they go to war. Yes.
But they don't go to Egypt. These 318.
No, not that we know of. No. Okay, the battle is still ongoing, so we got to make progress. 15, and he divided himself against them at night, right? That's what you do. You divide your camp, right? So you can get at people from two sides, and then also you can appear to be more than you really are. You asked, how does 318 people fight these mighty kings? Well, you have to have guerrilla tactics. You come at night, you split your camp, you scare them, they run away. So that's what happened. And he divided himself against them at night, he and his servants, and smote them, and he pursued them until Chovah, which is at the left of Damascus. Okay, so he starts at Dan, which is close to the Golan Heights, and then he ends up really a little closer to the sea, a little more west. But in any case, he battles them all the way on the way to Damascus. So in other words, a nice, 30, 40 kilometers. 16, and he restored all the possessions and also Lot and his brother and his possessions he restored, and also the woman and his people. Okay, so that's the battle. 16 verses of the battle. Okay, we're not done. Now the aftermath of the battle. And the king of Sodom came out toward him after his return from smiting Kedar Laomer and the kings who were with him to the valley of Shaveh, which is the valley of the king. And Malkitzedek, who's Malkitzedek? We don't know. Another king, Malkitzedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was a priest to the Most High God. So we have a king, the king of Salem. He honors Abraham, brings bread and wine, and he was a priest to God. And he blesses Abraham, and he blessed him. We'll see in a minute that it refers to Malkitzedek blessing Abraham. And he blessed him, and he said, "Blessed be Abraham to the Most High God, who possesses heaven and earth. And blessed is the Most High God, who has delivered your adversaries into your hand." And he gave him a tithe from all. Who gave who? Here it's clear. God, Abraham gives Malkitzedek, the priest, he gives him maaser, tithing. He gives him 10% of everything he got from the battle. Now, Malkitzedek is just a sideshow. In other words, and it's not a sideshow. In the story, it doesn't really fit. In other words, if you look at verse 17 says, the king of Sodom came out toward him. King of Sodom comes to greet Abraham. What did the king of Sodom do? It doesn't say anything. In the middle of the conversation about the king of Sodom, we take a break. Verse 18, 19, 20 talks about the different king Malkitzedek. And now verse 21, the Torah remembers to get back to king of Sodom. I'm only joking. Everything I'm saying is a reason, but I'm trying to point out the problems with the way it's written, so that will force us to look a little deeper. But in any case, so now we're back, and after we came in and we interjected 18, 19, and 20 about Malkitzedek, we go back to 17. King of Sodom greets Abraham, and then 21, and he tells Abraham, let's make a deal. Give me just a second, Jill. And the king of Sodom said to Abraham, give me the souls and the possessions take for yourself. In other words, in that culture, if you went to war and you captured, and you were victorious, you're entitled to all the possessions you captured and all the people. So now the king of Sodom doesn't have any people, doesn't have any possessions. Everything rightfully belongs to Abraham in that culture. So the king of Sodom says to Abraham, do me a favor, you can keep all the possessions, but give me the people. I want to be a king, right? You can't be a king if there's no people. So give me back my people. So Abraham says, I'm not taking anything. Abraham says, and Abraham said to king of Sodom, I raise my hand to the Lord, which is an oath, the Most High God, who possesses heaven and earth, neither from a thread to a shoe strap. In other words, I'm not even going to take a thread or a shoe strap, nor will I take from whatever is yours, that you should not say, I have made Abraham wealthy. He says, I don't want to have anything to do with the possessions of Sodom or from your king. I don't want people to say that you, meaning Sodom, made me wealthy. Then we continue. However, Abraham says, well, but you do have to pay me. He is taking part of the possessions of Sodom to give to who? To the people who are with him. Abraham says, I personally don't want anything, but my allies, you have to give them their share. Exclusive.
That's how we get the mitzvah to fill it.
Yeah, because he says shoe strap, right. So 24, exclusive of what the lads ate. In other words, the lads ate. In other words, there's expenses to the battle, right? But a battle is expenses. So you have to. Ammunition. Yes. So you have your food, you go to war. You win or lose a war, not so much on how powerful your army is, but if you can supply them, right? You have to come with food. That's what very smart people, very smart generals missed sometimes, that the war is going to be successful or you'll lose based on if you can feed your people. So Abraham understands that you got to reimburse the people who ate, and also the share of the men who went with me. In other words, the people who went to battle, they should get a share of the spoils, also as well as the people who were members of his covenant. In other words, his allies, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, they shall take their share, even though they didn't go to battle. And this happens later in the Torah, that we say that the people who go to war split the spoils with the people who stay home, because you also have to have people protecting the home turf. And that's the end of the story. And then we have the next story, is the covenant of the parts. There's a lot going on here, a lot to talk about. Just to think about that, somehow or another, this repetition here, the description of the battle, especially from verse 1 all the way till verse, I don't know, at least verse 8 is certainly not necessary, before Sodom pops in the picture. And you could have said this whole battle in 1 or 2 verses, but the Torah seems to be emphasizing something here. And the question, of course, is what's the purpose of the story? What's the purpose of speaking at it at such great lengths? Okay, Jill, go ahead, please. But you're on mute.
Rabbi, some year, I know this is not the time to deal with Malkitzedek, the priest of the Most High. How did he get there? Abraham wasn't alone. But that's a whole other path, and we're not on that path this year. So we'll do that another year.
No.
He was a priest. Okay, that's a really interesting thing. We just went over pretty fast.
No, Jill, next year, Thursday, we only do a little bit, and we have to wait for this year. Sunday, we take our time. So this is the time to deal with everything. If you want to talk about Malkitzedek, we have to talk about Malkitzedek.
Yes.
We have no
Okay, but he's the priest of the Most High. Obviously, he discovered what Abraham discovered. because he's already doing it. He's got a whole system going.
He has a system.
Um,
Again, Abraham respects him, and Abraham tithes. Abraham gives him tithes the spoils of the war. So almost like Abraham is not a priest of God. I would think that maybe Abraham is the priest of God, right? It's not even clear. If you read the Hebrew, it's not so clear who's the priest of God, right? Malkitzedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he is the priest to the Most High. Who is he? He could be Abraham. He could be Malkitzedek. It's not
Rabbi, also in the terms of Aaron is the priest. So as Melchizedek, is he standing in the boots of Abraham? Is he standing in the boots of Aaron? And from where did he get this inspiration? This seems to be equal. If he's already recognized the Most High, there's been another inspiration, and it opens up the question of, is there another, and why is there not an extension from Melchizedek?
That's a great, all good questions. All good questions. And also, so Abraham is not as exclusive as we thought he was. When we were kids, they told us he discovered monotheism. What are you talking about? Malkitzedek has been in business for a long time. He's the king of Salem. He's probably got his whole court. And so he discovered it already. So what's Abraham's claim to fame? So we want to figure out the interaction between Abraham and Malkitzedek. Excellent points.
Does Malkitzedek show up in the Chumash after this?
No, not in the 5 books of Moses. He does appear in the book of Joshua. Not him, but is Adoni Tzedek, master of Tzedek, instead of the king of Tzedek, also the king of Salem. So we assume, just like in those days, you had the pharaohs was the name of the king of Pharaoh. The name of the king of Egypt was the Pharaoh, and Abimelech was the name of the king of Gerar, even though there was over many generations. So we assume that in that region, the king of Salem, in the name there was always Tzedek, always righteousness. It's very interesting. Malkitzedek, the king of Tzedek, king of righteousness. Adoni Tzedek, the master of righteousness. So in that area, Salem, which, spoiler alert, we assume is Jerusalem, the king of, because Jerusalem also has the word Shalem, Yerushalayim is Shalem. So in Salem, the idea of the name of the king has the word Tzedek, righteousness, within it.
So do we assume that Malkitzedek becomes a Jew at some point?
Not necessarily. No, not necessarily. But even though he's not Jewish, Abraham is serving him. Abraham is honoring him, and Abraham is giving him the tithings, and he's the priest to the El Elyon, to the God on high, not to the idols, right?
So do we assume that David defeats his descendants?
I think that I think before in the days of Joshua, I have to go double check exactly what happens there. So I don't want to speak.
Because when David conquers Jerusalem.
Yeah, at that point, by the time David comes around, he really conquers it and buys it from the Jebusites. So in other words, between Joshua and King David, which is a few hundred years, probably almost 400 years, the Yevusim, the Jebusites, took over that region. And David is going to conquer it from the Jebusites.
Rabbi, I mean, the only thing I could see is Melchizedek is stationary, and Abraham takes the show on the road, more or less.
Okay, fine. That's one way to do it. You know what? Let's start with Malkitzedek. Instead of going back and then going forward, we'll start from the end. We'll start with Malkitzedek, and then we'll go back to the kings. Because again, it's very out of character for the Torah to spend so much time about battles that are really not that important for us on the surface. In other words, like I said, I could have written the whole verse, very simple. There was a battle, Lot was taken captive, Avram released him, done. I saved yourself 15 verses. Took us 35 minutes to read, okay? Could you imagine on a Shabbos, if you cut out all those verses, you finish the service early, you got to the chalent early, and everybody's happy, okay? So obviously there's a reason why this happens, but you know what? We'll start with Malkitzedek. So let's open up the verses and see what does Malkitzedek do? How does the verse describe Malkitzedek? And then we're going to try to compare and contrast that to Abraham. And again, everything I'm saying here is not 100% set in stone because a lot of it is theory, but a lot of this is based on Rabbi Shamshon Fal Hirsch and others. But we'll see what we can make of this. So let's see Malkitzedek. What do we know about Malkitzedek? So let's see. Verse 18, Malkitzedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was a priest to the Most High God. That's verse 18, right? And Malkitzedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was a priest to the Most High God. And he blesses him. In other words, Malkitzedek blesses Abraham, and he said, blessed be Abraham to the Most High God, who possesses heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, who has delivered your adversaries into your hand, and he gave him a tithe from all. Okay, that's the interaction. So if you want to think about Malkitzedek and say what's his relationship with God? So the first thing you're going to look at is you're going to say, what name do we use? And this is a name that does not appear. We actually use it in our prayers, Kel Elyon, every day, 3 times a day.
I recognize it from the prayers.
You're recognizing the prayers, but in the Torah, you don't find it. What is it? Kel Elyon. Kel is God, Elyon, the Most High, which sounds like, what a beautiful way to describe God, the Most High God. Could you think of a more beautiful way? Like Neil says in our daily prayer, the first blessing of the Amidah, we say, El Elyon, the Most On High God. Beautiful, wonderful description. But once you start, if you put yourself in the context of what the people at the time were saying, you can realize, you could say that Kel Elyon, the Most On High God, could actually be the opposite, actually telling you the limitation of Malkitzedek's understanding of what God is. And if you look at the Medrash, and Maimonides talks about this at great length, you understand that not all, but many of the idol worshippers understood that there is one God who is above all the idols. And the Medrash says they call him the God of the gods. In other words, there is a God on high who is the origin of everything. And by the way, he believes in righteousness, right? Malkitzedek, right?
So you think that El Elyon is Zeus?
Maybe. Well, let's put out what we know, and then you tell me where you want to place him. So the God on high, so there's a God above all the other gods who believes in righteousness. The problem is that the God on high also outsources the control of this earth to many other gods. And those gods have absolutely no interest in justice, right? So therefore, other people it wouldn't necessarily make sense to serve the God of justice because he's not really interested. So if you want to succeed in this world, you have to align yourself with the gods of war, of other forms of immorality, and they'll protect you because they have more power. So this is a mistake. So Abraham comes and says, in other words, what Abraham is saying is it's a mistake that God is on high. It's a mistake that God is on high. God is present and immanent, and there's no other power aside for him. That's Abraham's big idea. Now, Malkitzedek is the king of Salem, king of Salem. What does Salem mean? Salem means complete, wholesome, which means Malkitzedek believes that there has to be a place where we serve this one God, the God that's above everyone else, and that's consistent with his values. So there has to be one place of righteousness, right? But it's exclusive to one place because there are other forces and other gods. And if you're living in Sodom, there's no point of serving the God of righteousness. In other words, they're basically making a haven, a place to honor the one God. That's why Malkitzedek is the king of Salem. He's the king of Salem, complete, wholesome, but we don't see, there is no interaction between him and the kings around him. Abraham, especially in this chapter, is all over the board. He's in this parsha, but also in this chapter, he's an international figure. He's interacting with Aner, Eshkol, Mamre. He's dealing with the people of Sodom. He's negotiating with the king of Sodom. There's no interaction between Malkitzedek and the kings around him that we know of. There's no mention, which means he keeps to himself, which is Jill's point. Abraham's on the go and king of Salem keeps to himself. But it's not just a practical thing that the king of Salem is less outgoing. It's in their belief system. The king of Salem doesn't believe that God, who's supernal and above everybody else, actually controls the whole earth. He says, yeah, we have to make a small little town called Jerusalem. Where in that Jerusalem there is righteousness. But is righteousness the value for everybody? Of course not. The world is a jungle. You can't survive in the jungle with righteousness. Okay? So that is why the king of Salem says, So he understands that there's God, one God, above all the other gods. Kel Elyon, he's the God that's the most high. But that's also the problem, that he's being limited to the most on high. And by the way, it's not that God can't intercede into the world, because you'll see in a minute, he does tell Abraham, oh, also thank God for actually interacting and helping you, right? So that's what he says, verse 20, and blessed be the most high God who has delivered your adversaries into your hand. So in other words, the most high God, if he wants to get involved, he could. And that's why we're thanking him. But the point is, the most on high God is not really interested in what's happening on earth for the most part. And he's very happy to have a little shtibel, a little place, a little haven where you could, where there's righteousness. And that's why the city of Jerusalem, it was an important city, but it was not a city that interacted with other, it wasn't an important city. I'm saying as a symbol. It was a small little town on one of the mountains there that was called righteousness. By the way, one of the ways that we know that sages say that Tzedek, Malkitzedek is the king, that Salem is Jerusalem, is from the name, because the name of the king. Here it's Malkitzedek. There it's in Joshua, it's Adoni Tzedek. And they quote a verse from Isaiah, which says, Tzedek Yalin Ba, that in Jerusalem, righteousness dwells there, right? So the connection of Jerusalem and righteousness is found throughout the Bible. In any case, what we're saying is that they believe that you have to honor the King of Justice and make him a little place on earth that's a symbol for his power. And he's ultimately the ultimate God. But there are many other gods, and he delegates power to the other gods, and therefore there is no business in spreading righteousness throughout the land, because you can't survive on righteousness alone.
Isn't Malkitzedek then connected to Isaac?
In the sense that
Isaac's not a prophet, he doesn't go out.
But not philosophically. Philosophically, Isaac understands that God is the only power and God is everywhere. The question is, what's the best way to spread the godliness? Either to take your message open and to the masses. Problem with taking your message to the masses, if you're in advertising, you know that you have to dilute it to the common denominator, to the lowest common denominator. So Isaac says, I want to have fewer people, but I want to have people who are open and are on the level of understanding the sophistication of what I'm going to say. So therefore, his model of influencing people are different. But philosophically, he doesn't refer to God as Kel Elyon, the sublime God, the most on high God. You remember how many times it says on high, on high, on high in these 4 verses? And when we read it, it sounds like wonderful, God's on high. But what Abraham is trying to say, no, God is not on high. God is on earth. He's on high as well. So if you're looking for to see what Abraham is adding over Malkitzedek, is not disagreeing with Malkitzedek in the sense that, yes, God is on high, God is the most powerful, but Malkitzedek, the problem with Malkitzedek is, number one, he believes that there are other idols, other gods as well. Again, they get their power from the one God, but like the Medrash says, the one God is the God of gods, but there are other forces that have power. And therefore, he didn't see it practical to spread the notion of the one God, because the one God is not really going to help you if you're living outside of the Jerusalem, outside the haven of righteousness that we create to honor the God of righteousness. But he's not the most powerful God around here because he's out on vacation. So that is a little bit on Malkitzedek and why he's a great guy, but in no way does he understand everything that Abraham is preaching and Abraham is telling him. It's not just that he's keeping the message to himself, it's that he doesn't really fully understand the message.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi, can I ask you a question?
Explaining. It's not about explaining. Of course, Abraham explains it to him. But by the way, it's very interesting that in this case, just a second, Vicky. In this case, Abraham, it's very strange because everything that I said, you can question and disagree with everything I said, because in verse 22, Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I raise my hand to the Lord, the Most High God. He also says, Kel Elyon, and he also says, who possesses heaven and earth. He's echoing what the king of Salem said. Abraham himself saying the same thing, right? So obviously that could be a question, everything I said. You see, no, that means that Abraham agrees with the king of Salem. So I would say 2 things, just thinking about this right now. First of all, the only time Abraham speaks this language is when he's in the meeting of those 3 guys, of Abraham, king of Salem, and king of Sodom. Secondly, he's talking to the king of Sodom. The king of Sodom is not ready to accept Abraham's calling in the name of God, Vayikra Sham b'Shem Hashem, which Abraham has been doing in the last parsha and earlier, right? When Abraham wants to preach God, he says Shem Hashem, he says the name of Hashem. He doesn't say Kel Elyon. But maybe for the king of Sodom, he's not going to understand it. So he has to say, you know what, you understand the philosophy of the king of Sodom, of king of Salem. Okay, I'm going to talk to you in that language. In other words, it's not about explaining to people. It's about what they're willing to accept, what they're open to, what they're, in other words, it was radical. Abraham's teachings were so radical, it would require everybody to change everything they thought about God and the gods. And Abraham is not looking for confrontation at this point, right? He's looking for allies. So King of Salem is right. Of course, there's one God who's the most powerful and wants justice. And it's wonderful that he made a city that Malkitzedek, the king of justice, makes a city. In it, righteousness rules, and we are in that city. Righteousness is the value to honor the one God. It's a wonderful thing. Is that Judaism? No, because Judaism says there's only one God, and the other gods have no power. And righteousness, therefore, is not the domain of one little shtetl called Jerusalem, but it's universal. Now, is he open to hear that at that point? No. So Abraham is not necessarily using that opportunity to say it. But when he's speaking to the king of Sodom, he's mirroring what the king of Malkitzedek says, because probably my guess is that's the only message that Sodom, the king of Sodom, was willing to accept at that moment. That would be my interpretation. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I think you just answered my question, because I had the same thought about like a philosophical conversation between Abraham and Malkitzedek, because the problem with Malkitzedek philosophy is that he thinks that God is most high from all gods. Right. So that's why Abraham is trying to explain to him in verse 22. So yes, he is God of all gods, because he's created the heavens and earth. So he's trying to bring the idea of monotheism to kind of, instead of battling with Malkitzedek, just have a conversation and see if they can resolve the differences.
Correct. But if you notice that the word Kainish Mayim Ba'aretz, creator of heaven and earth, Malkitzedek also says that in verse 19. Verse 19, and he blessed him, and he said, blessed be Abraham to the Most High God, who possesses heaven and earth. By the way, possesses, what is possess is not the right word. Kone means to acquire. But in biblical Hebrew, to acquire means to create. Possesses means like God is interacting with the world right now. But kone doesn't mean that. Kone means the creation. In biblical Hebrew, kone, to acquire, is synonymous with creation, creating heaven and earth. In other words, God created the heaven and earth. But then the question is what he did then. So Malkitzedek says, now he's the God of all gods. He's the Most High. He's the God of gods. So he outsources most of the world to the other gods. So therefore, it would, like I said, therefore he's not in the business of trying to influence the king of Sodom. He doesn't believe that righteousness is the value that everybody should live by. It's too idealistic in his view. Yeah, we're going to create a place. We're going to create a little space where righteousness is the value, but you can't scale that up to the whole world, because the world's a jungle. The world to survive, you need to be willing to get your hands dirty. That's what he says, and Abraham, of course, disagrees.
Right. Thank you. And where does the righteousness come in?
I'm sorry.
Where does the righteousness come in? In
his name, because he believes the one God, is a righteous God. That he's right about that. He's right about that. So therefore,
it's not righteousness. Then it's just the fact that he's right comparing to other nations that worship other gods.
No, but the question is, what are the other gods' value? So there's I don't know all the Greek mythology, but you have in those days is the god of war. There's all kinds of gods, and the gods, not all the gods want justice, and not all the gods want righteousness, and that's why some people would say there's a reason why the wicked prosper, because the wicked gods are on their side, right? Righteousness is a value. Not all the gods care about righteousness. They want lust, they want pleasure, they want blood, they want violence. There's all kinds of gods, there's all kinds of values, and Malkitzedek understands. Oh, look. The most on high God, what does he value? He values righteousness. So you know what? We're going to create a little shtetl called Salem, wholesome, complete, not sort of separate and apart from the rest of society. And that's where we're going to celebrate righteousness. But could you scale righteousness all over the place? Of course not. Because there are other gods, and the other gods are don't go for righteousness. And my God is the most on high. So he was right about a lot of things. He just was not. It was just still idolatry, because the essence of monotheism is that there is no power other than God, right? The moment you say he's the God of all gods, but it means there's other forces that have legitimate power. That is still paganism.
But we use that phrase of God. God is the King of Kings.
Correct, but not in the context of not in the context of the way the idol worshippers used it. When the idol worshippers use King of Kings, means that he gives independent power to the other, gives autonomy to the other kings. When we use it, we say God we use it in the opposite sense, that God is the power that is even greater power and overpowers all other powers. In other words, basically saying the other kings are not autonomous because there's somebody above them controlling them, right? So there certainly is a hierarchy in the world. There's no question about that. The question becomes: do the other steps in the hierarchy have independent power? Right? Do the angels, do the sun and the moon, do these things have independent power? And everyone knows the famous medrash. That's the metaphor is that when you go down the street and you see a beautiful building, and then the question becomes: are you going to thank the builder? Or are you going to thank the hammer? And today it's not a hammer. Today you're going to, with the technology, you have a crane. How could you build a skyscraper without a crane? So you should go thank the crane. But that's ridiculous. Why can't you thank the crane? Because the crane has no choice. It has to do. So you only thank somebody that has choice. They say, Chamra Lamara, if wine belongs to the homeowner, but nevertheless you should thank the person serving the wine. Why? It's not his wine. You come to someone's house, they serve you wine. It's not the server's wine, it's the owner's wine. Yeah, but the server is a human being, so he has choice. Since he has choice whether or not to serve you, thank the person who's serving you, even though he's not the ultimate power. But something that has no choice, like a hammer, that you should not thank. It's ridiculous. It's actually not just ridiculous, it's offensive. It's offensive to the one who has choice, to the person using the hammer. So everybody agrees that there is a hammer. Everyone agrees that there's laws of nature through which God controls the world. The question becomes: are you going to serve those forces of nature? Are you going to serve the rain? Are you going to serve the sun? Are you going to serve? Serving would mean you attribute choice to those kings, and that's the big debate. The big debate is: did God outsource the autonomy, or is it everything still in God's power?
Rabbi, Talmud says that Malkitzedek was going to be the ancestor of the priests, but it was taken away from him because he mentions Abraham before Hashem.
Yeah, so there's different interpretations whether or not that was a good thing or a bad thing. Some people want to defend Malkitzedek. So what Mark is saying is, if you look at let's just show the verses. If you look at verses, so he says, verse 19, first he blesses Abraham. Blessed be Abraham to the Most High God, who possesses heaven and earth. And then he blesses the Most High God, right? So Mark is right that the Talmud criticizes Malkitzedek for speaking in that order. Other people say it's not so bad. In fact, what he's really saying is, blessed God, blessed is Abraham, because through Abraham, people know of God, right? Verse 19 and then 20, right? First he blesses Abraham, then he blesses God. And what he's really saying is, Abraham is blessed because through Abraham, God becomes blessed. So you can read it either way, but again, if he's putting God, following the interpretation that Mark offers from the Talmud, that's a symptom. I don't think that's the essential problem. I think that's a symptom. Why is God second? Not because God is less powerful, because God is less relevant. Because even though he is the beginning, he's ultimately at top of the hierarchy, he's the one who creates everything, but he's still removed. And he's not as relevant to this world, especially outside of the walls of Salem, outside of that spiritual haven. In Salem, he's holy. Outside of Salem, he's not that relevant because he outsourced those areas to other gods. Again, this is the interpretation that's basically saying that Malkitzedek is less than holy and is less than. Again, remember the proof is in the pudding. The fact that we don't hear from him, the fact that he's not interacting with people around him that's telling, but also the Torah seems to be saying he does have a nice relationship with God. In other words, within his little area, he is creating a seat to righteousness to honor God. He just doesn't understand that it doesn't spread to the whole world. But that's not just a detail. That's because he's making an essential mistake, and that is that God, like I said, that God outsources the power to other places.
So Midrashically, Malki connected to Job and to Jethro?
Some people say he's really, I think Rashi may say it, that he is, does Rashi say Malkitzedek Melech Salem? Let me see what Rashi says. Medrash Agada, there's a Medrash quoted in the Talmud that this is Shem ben Noach, it's Shem the son of Noach. So in other words, it's either Shem, but then you have to say Shem lived very long. So either Shem, the son of Noach, or a descendant of Shem. But the problem is, how did he discover the one God? That's really the question. The question is because it was in the family. Of the three sons of Noach, Shem was the most spiritual, the most in tune with God. We discussed that the name Shem. Shem means name, and name means what is the definition of everything. He's asking the questions of where everything comes from. So Shem has a relationship with God. Then Shem passes it on to his descendants. And he does a pretty good job at creating a space where there is a city with righteousness that serves God. It's wonderful. But the fact that they say it's exclusive to this area is not just because they don't know how to do a marketing campaign, and they can't spread the news. There is an essential problem. The essential problem is that now crept into them the mistake of the idol worshippers, which is, although, by the way, it's very logical to make that mistake, because if you think that God believes in righteousness, how come you look around the world and you see no righteousness? You see violence, and you see the wicked prevail, and you see that the people who dispose of righteousness, like Sodom, prosper, right? So it's a very logical conclusion to say that, yes, there's a God of righteousness, and we can serve him, and we're going to create a righteous environment, but that's not for the rest of the world, because the rest of the world, the God of righteousness outsourced. He has no interest in dealing with the rest of the world, and therefore there are other powers that are secondary to the one God who's above all other gods, but practically they're the ones who are invested in the world. So in other words, their mistake is very common. It's very logical. You look around the world, I see no traces of justice, at least not in that world. Today we advanced a little bit, or a lot.
But midrashically, is he connected to Job and to Jethro?
I don't know. I can't say no because I didn't see every medrash. But the medrash that Rashi quotes is Shem, and Shem is nice because Shem is telling you that there's putting him in the spiritual line to Noach and to Shem, who were obviously well aware of God. So it's not like he had to discover it on his own. Abraham emerges from a place of idol worshippers, so he discovers it on his own. And remember, if he discovered it on his own, he discovered the truth. Here, it seems like the knowledge of the one God is they still have it, but it's diluted because there are other ideas that creep in. Right? It's the mistake, not that there's no God. It's the mistake that the one God is so sublime, he's so high that he doesn't really care about the rest of the world, so he outsources it. So making God great is actually pushing him upward, right? You're pushing him upward. It's nice, but God is great. God is also present, and that's the two sides. And he was lacking in the other side and how God's immanent and present within the world. Go ahead, Vicky.
I just wanted to comment on something that Mark said and on this discussion in general. I don't have a feeling that they're talking about the same God. I mean, Malkitzedek, he doesn't have a feeling for oneness of God that Abraham has, and that's what he's trying to resolve in verse 22, but he can't. And this conversation lasts until this day.
But Vicky, if Malkitzedek was an idol worshiper, Abraham would not give him tithings. Abraham would not give him 10% of
I'm looking that he's idol worshiper. Even within somebody who admits the idea of one God, there is a different understanding of it.
Correct.
So they're talking about gods.
I
and
agree.
That's like criticizing Malkitzedek that he's blessing God. He's not blessing the same God Abraham's blessing.
Correct. In other words, yes, you're right. If you believe that God is the God of all other gods, but there are other gods, or you believe that God is the only God, you're not talking about the same God. That's true. But understand that he is talking to the God who he believes is the most on high, the origin of everything, and the God who believes in righteousness. That is very advanced for his region and for his times. So you got to give him credit. And you know what? Abraham gives him 10% of the spoils of the war, which were a lot, because remember, Sodom was a very wealthy city. Okay, so we only have about a few minutes left, and I don't want to go into the whole battle with the 4 kings and the 5 kings. We'll do that next week. In other words, why does the Torah speak about at length? But I do want to talk about the placement, and I alluded to this, where the king of Sodom is sort of out of place. Verse 17 and the king of Sodom came out toward him after his return from smiting Kedar Laomer. So we're in the middle of a conversation between king of Sodom. So naturally, right after verse 17 should be verse 21. And the king of Sodom said to Abraham, right? It says, the king of Sodom greets Abraham. And then what did he say? What happened at that meeting? What do they do? Doesn't say anything. We jumped 17, 18, 19. Why are you putting in 17, 18, 19 in middle of the story? I'm sorry, not 17. Why are you putting 18, 19, and 20 in the middle of the conversation, in the middle of the story of the king of Sodom, right? You should put 17 after 20, right? Talk about Malkitzedek, and then talk about the king of Sodom. Where we say, king of Sodom came, then we jump to Malkitzedek 3 verses, then we go back to the king of Sodom. Why are we doing this? So here, the commentaries have a beautiful interpretation written by the Or HaChaim and others, that this is just a literary tool. What we're trying to do is, Torah wants you to compare and contrast king of Sodom to Malkitzedek. Malkitzedek gained nothing from the war of Abraham. He owes Abraham nothing. Abraham did not release his people, nothing. Yet, what does Malkitzedek do? He honors Abraham. And therefore, the custom was, like Rashi says, he brings out bread and wine. That was the way that you honor. Rashi says, this is the custom that you do to people who are tired from war. Somebody comes back from war, you be a mensch. You bring him bread and wine. That's a symbol that you're honoring them and you are giving them respect. This is Malkitzedek, and he praises Abraham. He doesn't ask Abraham for anything, and he honors Abraham, even though he doesn't really owe Abraham anything. Now let's think about the king of Sodom. King of Sodom, he's now tremendously indebted to Abraham, right? Because Abraham attacked and released all his people and his possessions from the 4 kings. So you would expect that the king of Sodom should bring bread and wine to Abraham. Yet he does not. And that's why we place verse 18, 19, and 20 to show you the contrast, to say, compare king of Sodom to the king of Salem. Now, what does he do? According to the law, prevalent in those days, if Abraham, and you'll see, king of Sodom agrees, if Abraham went to battle, and if Abraham conquered the 4 kings, he's entitled to all the spoils of war, including the people. King of Sodom shows up to Abraham with arrogance. He basically says, give me, instead of giving bread and wine, Malkitzedek gives to Abraham. King of Sodom shows up and he says, give me the souls and the possessions take for yourself. In other words, he's not honoring Abraham at all. Why? Because he's arrogant, he's into himself, and therefore he comes, instead of thanking Abraham and thanking God, he's oblivious to God, right? He's oblivious to God, he's almost oblivious to Abraham. All he is he's focused on the self, and he says, give me the souls and the possessions take for yourself. In other words, what we're doing is we're contrasting the attitude to the king of Salem to the king of Sodom, because we want to get insight into the attitude of Sodom. Sodom, they're not grateful people. And even when Abraham comes back from war of releasing all the people of Sodom, you don't get a thank you from the king of Sodom. You don't get bread and wine. And certainly you don't get any humility before Abraham. Instead, he started negotiating as if they're equals. And if you go back a little earlier, verse 17, and the king of Sodom came out toward him after his return from smiting Kedar Laomer and the kings who were with him to the valley of Shaveh, what is Shaveh, which is the valley of the king. What's Shaveh? So there's different interpretations. Shaveh literally means equal. So some people say it's called the valley of Shaveh because then everybody, all the kings in the region honored Abraham. That's one interpretation. But another interpretation would be negative for the king of Sodom. King of Sodom comes to Abraham like a Shaveh, like an equal. Hey, I'm a king, you're a king, let's negotiate. But in reality, that is a distorted picture of the reality. Reality is that king of Sodom has to be thankful to Abraham, yet he is not. And placing, I'm not saying that's the only reason why Malkitzedek's story is here. We need to hear about Malkitzedek because we have to understand the contrast him to Abraham. But the fact that verse 18, 19, and 20 are in between the story of king of Sodom, who wants you to contrast the king of Sodom to the king of Malkitzedek, where king of Sodom does not bring the bread and wine, does not praise God, does not praise Abraham. All he wants to know, the first word is what? Give me. Guy came back from war. Give him a bagel, give him lox, give him bread, give him wine. He shows up, he says, give me, ten li'anefesh, give me the souls, give me. And that's, of course, the attitude of Sodom. And that also gives us insight, if that's the king, that's what happens to the people as well. So this is just touching upon, I did not really mean to talk about this today, because this is way verse 17. I'm still stuck at verse 1, chapter 14, verse 1. So I'm way back. So next week we go way back to verse 1, chapter 14, verse 1. But it was good to get into the story and very good to understand Malkitzedek, even though he has a great name. King of justice, God on the most on high God, right? But you have to learn to read subtly and say, sometimes if you compliment God too much, if you make him too great, too sublime, basically you're saying he's so great, he's not interested in what I'm doing. I'm going to go do whatever I want. I'm going to go rob the bank. So be careful about making God too great.
So if the king of Sodom is disrespectful to Abraham, how come Abraham doesn't respond to that particular aspect?
So what's his response? Basically, Abraham says, I don't want to have anything to do with you. Right? This king of Sodom, he negotiates. I don't want anything to do with you. I don't want any of the possessions. By the way, that may be a problem. Some people say there was a problem. He should have taken the souls. He should have become the king. We'll get to that later. But you see what Abraham is basically saying, I want nothing to do with you because of you're so arrogant and so self-centered and so self-oriented. Even in the face of this unbelievable victory, you can't say thank you, not to Abraham, not to God. It's all about yourself. Just I can't deal with you. I don't want a relationship with you. As opposed to king of Salem. Okay, he has a problem in his philosophy. He doesn't fully understand the one God. Abraham writes him a check for 10% of his assets, right? So Abraham wants a relationship with him because there's who to talk to. With Sodom, there's no one to talk to. King of Sodom, I should say.
Rabbi, and where does it say that he wants to exchange possessions for souls?
Right here, verse 20. Not exchange. That's the thing. Verse 21. The king of Sodom said to Abraham, give me the souls and the possessions take for yourself. What is he saying? What does Abraham have to give him the souls? Because it belongs to Abraham, right? If he says, give me the souls, means it belongs to Abraham. The people belong to Abraham. And the possessions belong to Abraham. So he says, you know what? Let's make a deal. I'll give you 50%. It's like, imagine I come to you and I say, you know what? Let's make you a deal. I'll let you keep 50% of your assets. Give me the other 50%. What are you talking about? It all belongs to me, right? So king of Sodom is a tremendously arrogant statement where he says, give me the souls and you keep the possessions. Who are you, right? Everything belongs to Abraham. Abraham says, I'm not taking anything. I don't want the souls. I don't want possessions. I don't want you to think that you make Abraham rich. You make Abraham great. Abraham doesn't want possessions from Sodom because what does Sodom represent? Sodom represents a society which is the opposite of justice. I don't want to become wealthy. We have another problem. Why Abraham takes possessions. We'll deal with that next week. Why Abraham takes possessions from Pharaoh, but not from Sodom. So we'll deal with it. Takes from everybody except from Sodom. So we'll deal with that later because Abraham has Pharaoh has a lot of problems, but he's not the antithesis of justice, not the antithesis of charity. Abraham cannot take the possessions of Sodom. Sodom can't make Abraham wealthy. That philosophy that outlaws charity, Abraham says, I cannot become wealthy from that. That cannot contribute to me. I want nothing to do with that way of life.
That's like a person who steals, when they try to do an offering in the temple
Yes.
from stolen goods.
Right.
Hashem, it's an abomination to Hashem.
Correct. But again, a Pharaoh himself is not that righteous, but is not the antithesis of everything Abraham stands for. Abraham stands for, like we're going to see in next week's parsha, tzedakah umishpat, charity and righteousness, charity and justice. Sodom is the opposite of charity, the opposite of justice. Abraham says, I cannot have holdings that I get from Sodom, which represents the antithesis of everything I believe in.
It would tarnish anything that he got.
Yes.
If you get something from a thief,
yes,
it's tarnished.
What do they call the people?
It has a bad energy.
Yes. What do they call the people?
Stolen merchandise from the street and you're wearing around someone else's watch. You stolen, like in Nigeria, ripped off someone and you're wearing that watch. You got that energy on you.
Indeed.
So you gotta be careful in life about where you get
your
money
stock
from.
portfolio. Yes.
Stolen money, it's very bad.
Agreed. What do we call the people who don't want to invest in things that they don't agree with morally?
Socially conscious investors.
There we go. Abraham was a socially conscious investor. He's not going to have Sodom's assets in his portfolio. There you have it.